She gave me just 72 hours to tear down my own home. No notice, no hearing. Not even a question, and just a deadline and a smile that said she'd already won. But the second she tried to lock me out of my own cabin, she lit a fire no policy could ever put out. If you've ever had a power-hungry HOA president treat their badge like a crown, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm David Miller, 58 years old. After 35 years as a county land inspector in California, I thought I'd finally found some peace. My father had left me a cabin on Pine Lake, part of a 50-acre plot he bought in 1985 to create a quiet, respectful neighborhood. For a while, it was exactly that. Then Margaret Thompson arrived 3 years ago. At 52, she quickly installed herself as HOA president and turned the neighborhood into her own personal fiefdom. She enforced bizarre rules: no laundry lines, no planting flowers without a permit, and even the color of your house paint had to be approved. Most of the neighbors kept their heads down to avoid getting caught in her web, but I'd spent decades dealing with people like her, and she had no idea that I knew every law, every loophole, every inch of that land, and she'd just made the wrong choice trying to push me around. It all started because I planted a single sunflower out front. Just a small seed I threw into the soil because I liked the idea of something bright and cheerful to greet me each morning. The very next day, Margaret showed up with her clipboard and that smug smile, telling me I needed HOA approval to make any landscaping changes. I politely told her it was my property and I'd plant whatever I wanted. That's when I saw her face darken, the fake friendliness dropping away. She didn't know that back in 1985, my father had bought the whole 50-acre tract around Pine Lake and leased 45 acres to the HOA for a symbolic $1 a year. His dream was to build a community where families could thrive together. I'd inherited the land and never raised the rent, thinking good neighbors didn't need a heavy hand. When I refused to ask permission for my sunflower, Margaret launched what I can only call a campaign of harassment. It started with petty fines but quickly grew worse. Monday, I got a $200 penalty for improper vehicle placement because my old pickup had been parked in the same spot for 3 years on my own land. Wednesday, there was a $300 fine for unauthorized construction, all because of the wooden fishing chair I built by the lake. Friday, I was slapped with a $150 fine because the natural wood on my cabin apparently didn't match her approved color palette. Each notice came with threats of further enforcement and ominous talk of community standards violations. I started documenting everything. My 35 years as a land inspector had taught me the power of careful records. I took photos of each citation, logged every time Margaret came by, and began digging into the HOA's founding documents. Her aggressive tactics didn't sit right with me, and my professional instincts told me there was something deeper going on. Margaret's next move was far more devious and far more painful. She held an emergency home meeting without inviting me, where she cast me as a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. Neighbors I'd known for years started avoiding me. Mrs. Garcia no longer waved from her garden. Tom Johnson, who used to invite me over for barbecues, wouldn't even look at me. Margaret spread rumors that I was a danger, that I had anger issues, that my very presence was destroying property values. She painted herself as the brave protector of the community, guarding them from the unstable old man by the lake. The isolation cut deep. These weren't just neighbors, they'd become friends. But Margaret made one fatal mistake. She underestimated my patience and my experience. While she was busy turning everyone against me, I was quietly building my own case. I set up extra security cameras and recorded every interaction. More importantly, I began pulling the public records on the HOA's finances and reviewed the original land agreements my father signed. Then things took a darker turn. Margaret decided to call the police, accusing me of making threats during a conversation about her authority. When the officers showed up, they were professional and thorough, taking statements from both of us and reviewing the security footage. The video showed me standing calmly on my own property, politely asking questions. The false police report Margaret filed completely backfired, but not before causing me a lot of stress and embarrassment. Having police cruisers show up at your driveway tends to fuel neighborhood gossip, and Margaret made sure everyone knew all about it. She posted on the community's social media page, stirring up concerns about safety and calling for stricter measures against residents who didn't comply with the rules. What she didn't realize was that the officers who responded were no strangers to overzealous HOA complaints. Officer Martinez pulled me aside and quietly advised, "Document everything carefully. We see this kind of thing more often than you'd expect." Power makes people forget there are laws against harassment and false reports. Margaret's harassment soon took a more direct and personal turn. One day after coming back from the grocery store, I found my mailbox had been removed and replaced with a temporary post bearing a notice about non-conforming mailbox violations. That mailbox had stood there for decades, but Margaret insisted it didn't meet the current HOA standards. She also had the landscaping crew accidentally trim branches from the oak tree that shaded my porch, claiming they were intruding into common areas. The tree was clearly on my land, but Margaret seemed to believe that her HOA role gave her authority over everything in sight. Every move she made was carefully calculated and just legal enough to avoid criminal charges, but intrusive enough to make my life unbearable. The psychological pressure was intense. Slowly, I began to understand how people could be forced out of their homes by relentless harassment even when they were in the right. Margaret was counting on me to surrender and leave, not realizing I was quietly documenting every offense, backed by decades of experience in property law and public administration. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. After a Sutley run, I returned home to find my fence destroyed and my sunflower, the very flower that started this whole ordeal, cut down at the roots. Margaret had hired a landscaping crew to remove non-compliant plants and structures while I was away. The wooden fence I'd built around my garden lay in ruins. Taped to my front door was a final notice: "Last warning. Serious HOA violations. You have 72 hours to voluntarily demolish non-conforming structures or the HOA will enforce compliance." The security cameras caught it all, and Margaret directing 3 men to destroy my property while saying, "This old man needs to learn his place." That evening, sitting in my cabin, staring at the wreckage and the empty spot where my sunflower once stood, I finally smiled. Margaret had crossed the line from mere harassment into criminal property damage. More importantly, she had no idea what she had just unleashed. I went down to the basement safe where I'd kept my father's legal documents for 40 years. It was time Margaret learned exactly who she was dealing with. My first call was to James Morrison, the real estate attorney who'd helped my father set up the original land deal back in 1985. At 72, James was still sharp as ever and practically rubbed his hands together when I explained the situation. "David," he said with a chuckle, "I've been waiting 40 years for this call. These HOA tyrants need a lesson on the difference between real authority and imaginary power." We spent 3 hours going through the original lease agreement. James' smile grew wider with every page. The contract had a clause allowing rent adjustments to fair market value with 30 days notice. For 4 decades, I'd charged the HOA just $1 per year for 45 acres of prime lakefront property. Today, the going rate for land like that was around $10,000 per acre annually. The legal ramifications were staggering. Not only could I raise their rent to $450,000 a year, but Margaret's destruction of my property gave me grounds for criminal charges and civil damages. James drafted the official rent increase notice, while I gathered evidence of Margaret's harassment. My background as a county land inspector proved invaluable as I conducted a detailed audit of the HOA's activities. What I uncovered was shocking even for Margaret. She'd been blatantly violating both the lease agreement and state HOA regulations for over 2 years. The clubhouse and swimming pool had been built on my land without proper authorization. A broken bar. The clubhouse and swimming pool had been constructed on my land without the owner's consent, a blatant violation of the lease terms. Margaret had also unilaterally raised HOA fees from $200 to $400 a month, bypassing the proper member voting procedures. Most damaging of all, she diverted $15,000 from the community fund to pay for landscaping improvements on her personal property. As I dug deeper, I uncovered falsified meeting minutes, forged signatures on official documents, and even proof that Margaret had threatened residents with fines if they didn't vote for her in HOA elections. She wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was running what looked like a criminal operation disguised as community governance. Then, in a surprising turn, Margaret's husband, Robert Thompson, showed up at my door one evening at 8 p.m. He looked worn out and genuinely remorseful. "Mr. Miller, I can't stand by and watch this anymore," he said quietly. "Margaret has become someone I don't recognize. Power has made her cruel." Robert told me that Margaret's behavior at home had grown erratic and controlling. She monitored his conversations, checked his phone, and flew into rage whenever anyone questioned her HOA decisions. He handed me a USB drive containing Margaret's emails and text messages with other board members, including evidence of vote manipulation and financial irregularities. "This is proof she forged signatures to become HOA president," Robert whispered as he handed me printed emails. "And here's a list of families she threatened with fines if they didn't support her." The evidence was overwhelming and gave me the last pieces I needed to build a solid case against Margaret's reign of terror. James and I finalized the legal documents that would end her power trip once and for all. The official notice was simple and devastating. Effective 30 days from this date, the annual lease fee for Pine Lake Community will be adjusted from $1 to $450,000, reflecting fair market rates for comparable lakefront property. We also prepared a civil lawsuit against Margaret personally for property damage, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. A criminal complaint for destruction of property was ready to be filed with the Sheriff's Department. But the most crucial document was the formal request for an emergency home meeting to address these critical issues threatening the community's future. Using my network of former colleagues, I connected with Sarah Kim, an investigative reporter for the local ABC affiliate specializing in HOA abuse stories. "This is exactly the kind of story our viewers need to hear," she said eagerly. "People are fed up with petty tyrants hiding behind homeowner association bylaws." Sarah's preliminary research showed Margaret's behavior wasn't isolated. She had been forced to leave her previous community after similar conflicts, and online complaints about her management style dated back years. "This wasn't just my fight, it was a pattern of abuse demanding public attention." The weekend gave me time to prepare for what I knew would be the most important community meeting in Pine Lake's history. Margaret had spent months positioning herself as the protector of community standards. Now she was about to learn that real authority doesn't come from bullying tactics or fake titles. I sent formal meeting notices to all 67 households in the Pine Lake community, as allowed under HOA bylaws. The subject line was straightforward: critical information about land ownership and community future. Margaret called within the hour, screaming about my unauthorized meeting, but I calmly reminded her that any community member could call emergency sessions when vital issues arose. By 7 p.m. on Wednesday, the community hall was packed beyond capacity. 89 people crammed into a space built for 50. With neighbors from adjacent communities drawn by rumors of drama. Sarah Kim and her cameraman took positions at the back, filming under Margaret's reluctant permission, granted under public meeting laws. Margaret arrived carrying a thick folder of documents, clearly expecting to control the narrative. She had no idea her 40-year reign of ignorance was about to end in the most public way possible. As the community settled, the tension was thick. Everyone knew something big was coming, they just didn't know what. I stood before the crowd, which had become like a second family, and asked a simple question: how many of you actually know who owns the land that Pine Lake community sits on? Confused murmurs and blank stares answered for them. Margaret's face went pale, but she still believed she could control the room. I continued: "Margaret, since you're so concerned about property rights and community standards, would you care to explain who holds the deed to these 45 acres? When she stayed silent, I pulled out the leather folder containing my father's original documents. "Let me introduce myself properly. I'm David Miller, son of Robert Miller, who purchased this entire 50-acre tract in 1985. I am the landlord. You've been paying $1 a year to rent this land." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop as 89 people absorbed the weight of what I had just revealed. Margaret looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Murmurs of shock and confusion rippled through the crowd. I connected my laptop to the projector and began methodically presenting the evidence of Margaret's. I displayed the violations one by one. Security footage showed Margaret directing the destruction of my fence and sunflowers, crystal clear with her voice audible, ordering the men to teach this old man his place. The financial records were even worse. Spreadsheets revealed unauthorized fee hikes, invoices totaling $15,000 for personal landscaping charged to community funds, and forged meeting minutes where Margaret had literally signed other people's names to approve her proposals. Each new revelation drew gasps of outrage from the crowd, neighbors watching their trust being shattered in real time. But the most disturbing evidence were the threatening emails Margaret had sent to families who questioned her authority. Robert's evidence filled the screen, message after message where Margaret warned of fines, legal action, even eviction for anyone opposing her. Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman who had stopped waving to me, stood up, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "Margaret told us you were dangerous, that you threatened violence. I was too scared to talk to you." Her voice cracked as she recounted how Margaret had isolated her just for asking questions about the budget. "Tom Johnson, my old barbecue buddy, followed. Margaret fined me $800 for letting my kids play on the grass after 6 p.m. She said it was damaging community property. We had to cut back on groceries to pay those fines." Story after story poured out tales of financial harassment, social manipulation, and outright bullying disguised as community governance. Lisa Park, a single mother of two, delivered one of the most heartbreaking testimonies. "Margaret threatened to have my children removed from the playground if I didn't vote for her in the last election. She said troublemaking families aren't welcome in Pine Lake." The room erupted in angry murmurs as the crowd realized the full extent of Margaret's abuse of power. Finally, Margaret found her voice, standing and shouting over the noise. "You're all being manipulated. I've worked tirelessly to improve this community. Every rule I've implemented was for your own good." Her face flushed with fury as she pointed accusingly. "This old man is trying to destroy everything we've built together." I met her glare calmly. "What exactly have we built, Margaret?" "A community where neighbors are afraid to plant flowers, where children can't play outside after 6 p.m., where families go hungry paying your arbitrary fines." Her screaming only made her seem more unhinged. "You don't have the right to humiliate me in front of everyone," Margaret shrieked, her carefully maintained facade shattering completely. "I am the president of this HOA." The irony was perfect. At the peak of her claimed authority, she had never looked more powerless. Sarah Kim, the reporter, asked for permission to speak to the community as an outsider. "I've covered dozens of HOA disputes across the state," she began. "What I've witnessed here tonight is one of the clearest cases of power abuse I've ever documented. Mr. Miller has the legal right to terminate this lease agreement entirely." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Their entire community could be dissolved overnight if I chose to exercise my property rights. But I had a different plan. "I have no intention of displacing families from their homes," I announced firmly. "But we need new leadership that serves the community instead of exploiting it." The no-confidence vote was decisive. 64 residents voted to remove Margaret from all HOA positions, with only 2 opposing and 1 abstention. Relief swept through the room. Their nightmare was finally over. Margaret sat stunned, silenced as the community she had terrorized for 3 years formally rejected her authority. She gathered her papers and left without a word, followed by the uncomfortable stares of those she'd spent years intimidating. Robert stayed behind, apologizing to families individually and promising full cooperation in recovering the stolen community funds. The man seemed genuinely relieved to be free of her shadow, freed from his wife's toxic influence. Mrs. Garcia was unanimously elected interim HOA president, bringing with her 30 years of experience as an elementary school principal. Her first official act was to apologize to me on behalf of the community and ask for my guidance in establishing fair, transparent governance policies. That very night, local news coverage began. Sarah Kim's initial report sparked hundreds of supportive comments from viewers who had experienced similar HOA harassment. Our story quickly became a symbol of successful resistance against petty tyranny, inspiring others to stand up for their rights. Mrs. Garcia proved to be everything Margaret was not: collaborative, transparent, and genuinely committed to serving the community rather than controlling it. Her first official meeting drew 53 attendees, a dramatic increase from Margaret's usual 8 to 10. The new board included Tom Johnson as treasurer, Lisa Park as secretary, Dr. Martinez as legal advisor, and, Surprisingly, Robert Thompson, determined to atone for his wife's actions. The first order of business was financial transparency. HOA fees were immediately reduced from $400 to $250 per month, with detailed budgets distributed to every household. All expenditures over $500 required community approval, and monthly financial reports were mailed to each resident. Property regulations were completely overhauled. The absurd restrictions Margaret had imposed were eliminated, leaving only basic safety and sanitation rules. Residents were now free to plant flowers without permits, hang laundry outside, and let their children play until 8 p.m. instead of 6. The shift in community atmosphere was immediate and remarkable. Margaret and Robert's divorce proceedings moved swiftly. Robert gained custody of their 2 teenage children, who had been embarrassed by their mother's public behavior. Margaret was forced to sell the house to pay restitution for the $15,000 she had stolen from community funds, plus $5,000 in damages for destroying my property. Criminal charges for property destruction resulted in a $2,000 fine and 100 hours of community service, which Margaret completed at a homeless shelter under court supervision. She was also required to attend anger management classes and was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. Most satisfying of all, Margaret's departure was entirely voluntary. Rather than face daily reminders of her public humiliation, she moved to Florida to live with her sister. Robert stayed in Pine Lake with the kids, becoming a respected community member as he worked to repair the damage caused by his ex-wife. Sarah Kim's follow-up report, titled "The $1 Landlord Who Fought Back," went viral, amassing over 2 million views across multiple platforms. The story resonated nationwide with viewers who had faced similar HOA harassment, turning our community dispute into a symbol of successful resistance against bureaucratic bullying. I received hundreds of emails from people sharing their own HOA horror stories and asking for advice. Several attorneys reached out about using our case as precedent in similar disputes. The attention was overwhelming but ultimately positive, spotlighting the urgent need for HOA reform across the country. Our story even helped California pass what became known as the Pine Lake Amendment. The new law required all HOAs to keep transparent financial records, establish clear appeal processes for violations, and submit to state oversight whenever abuse complaints crossed certain thresholds. Our local dispute had sparked statewide policy changes protecting homeowners from future tyrants like Margaret. Pine Lake transformed from a neighborhood defined by fear and petty rules into one of the most sought-after communities in the county. Property values rose by 15%, not because of harsh restrictions, but because people genuinely wanted to live where neighbors treated each other with respect and kindness. The waiting list to buy homes here stretched 3 months, with prospective buyers specifically praising our collaborative governance model and strong community spirit. We had proven that neighborhoods flourish through cooperation and mutual respect, not fear and micromanagement. Mrs. Garcia and I teamed up to offer consulting services to other communities wrestling with HOA disputes. Our success gave hope to residents nationwide feeling trapped by petty tyrants in their own neighborhoods. Tom Johnson and I started monthly workshops teaching practical skills to local kids, while Lisa Park was elected to the city council, bringing our cooperative approach to municipal government. Today, exactly 2 years after my confrontation with Margaret, I sit in the very wooden chair she once tried to destroy, gazing out over a community garden shared by 15 families growing sunflowers together. We planted those sunflowers to commemorate what we now call Sunflower Day, the anniversary of our community's rebirth through standing up to tyranny. A small wooden sign on my cabin door, carved by Robert as a gesture of friendship, reads, "David Miller, community friend." But the title I cherish most isn't on any sign, it's the sound of children playing on the grass until 8 p.m., the sight of neighbors chatting over garden fences, and the knowledge that we built something better from the ashes of Margaret's toxic regime. My father bought this land 40 years ago dreaming of a peaceful community. It took 4 decades, a power-hungry tyrant, and one old man's refusal to be bullied, but that dream finally became reality. Sometimes protecting peace means fighting for it. And the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's building something beautiful from what they tried to destroy. Margaret tried to make me the enemy of this community. In the end, She helped me become its greatest friend. The sunflowers in our garden now stand 8 feet tall, turning their faces toward the light just as our neighborhood learned to turn away from darkness and toward hope. The real lesson isn't just about defeating petty tyrants, though that's certainly satisfying. It's about remembering that true power doesn't come from intimidation or forced authority. It comes from service, respect, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you stand alone. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room turns out to be the strongest.